All right, so I actually got a little bit of good news here for you guys coming out of the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, who just dropped a rule that I'm not even kidding is going to be an absolute game changer. So here from More Perfect Union on just some of the details, they say breaking, the NLRB has ruled that if bosses commit unfair labor practices in the run-up to a union election, which basically they do every single time, right? We've talked about this with Starbucks and Amazon, etc., right? This is just standard practice, and then there isn't really a penalty financially or otherwise for these corporations engaging in illegal union busting activity. And so this is one of the ways that they're going to try to work around that. So they say if they engage in those illegal or unfair union busting practices, then the election will be canceled and the board will order the employer to immediately recognize and bargain with the union. Union busting just got a lot harder. I mean, this is just like absolutely game changing. Again, basically what we've seen whenever there's some chance to, potentially organize one of these unions, especially when you're up against some gigantic multi-billion-dollar international company, right? Like Amazon, for example, a perfect example of that. And, they're just rampantly engaging in these illegal union busting activities, forcing workers to go to captive audience meeting where they're spouting off anti-union messaging and putting up flyers everywhere from like their workstations to the bathrooms and pressuring workers and making them feel as though they could potentially lose their jobs, or in some cases literally outright firing them during the union organizing process. And so what this is basically saying is that, if you have the adequate amount of employees, if a, majority of employees say that they want to form a union, then the next step would be the employer says, well, hold on a second, I'm not just going to recognize the union, I want to hold an election. And then you have these elections take place, and the entirety of the environment in which that election takes place will be drastically changed if that corporation knows that, any unfair labor practices would basically just give the potential union the W in its formation just from the outset of them breaking some of those labor rules. So, I mean, again, it's a gigantic ruling update. Let's see if they got anything more in this thread here from More Perfect Union. They say now every union campaign has to go to an election. So they're talking about what the current status quo is. They have to go to this election to get formal recognition, but bosses use that time to union bust, often illegally. Now, if a majority of workers support the union, bosses will have to stop union busting or be forced to negotiate with no election at all. And obviously you're probably still going to have some of those issues that we've talked about where then they just go ahead and don't negotiate in good faith, but that could potentially be another thing that they end up cracking down on. And they say, as the chair of the NLRB says, quote, it eliminates incentives for employers to commit unfair labor practices as a way to delay or defeat representation when a majority of workers have shown their support for a union. And again, credit to the Joe Biden administration. We're going to get to a little bit of, more of his backstory here in a second and how he has actually acted towards labor during his presidency so far. But first, I just want to get to the first example, it looks like, of this new rule being put in place. And apparently it's going to actually apply retroactively to, I guess, some of these unions who were already engaged in this process. So they say apparently the Trader Joe's union, Trader Joe's Unite, has filed what appears to be the first charge under the recent NLRB ruling that says if a union demonstrates majority support and bosses proceed to union bust, the board can scrap the election and force the company to negotiate. They say the ruling is retroactive and the case pertains to the rampant union busting conducted by Trader Joe's leading up to the April election at the NYC Essex Crossing location. So, I mean, we're going to get to see the first example of this. I'm excited to see how this plays out, if they're actually going to use this as a chance to set the standard and sort of like put these corporations in check. And now I want to go ahead and get on to this other report that recently came out from the Treasury Department, which I think just number one sort of like reinforces what we already know about how beneficial unions can be to workers, especially here in the United States, where we've had just decades and decades of hollowing out union power and destroying unions in the U.S. So they put out this new report here. They say from MarketWatch, unions are key to reversing stagnant wages and economic inequality, the Treasury Department says in a first-of-its-kind report. You don't say. So they say the decline of U.S. worker power since the 1970s, essentially the ushering in of the neoliberal era of privatization of the economy, of gutting of regulations and cutting taxes for the wealthiest corporations and billionaires, trickle-down economics, and also, again, destroying unions. But they say that this has led to inequality and stagnant wages, and supporting unions may be the key to reversing that trend, the Biden administration said on Monday. President Joe Biden often calls himself the most pro-union president in American history. Obviously, I mean, in the neoliberal era, I think you could apply that moniker to him. I don't think that that would apply throughout the entire history. I mean, we've had presidents like FDR that have existed. So the idea that like he's this perfect, has a perfect track record when it comes to unions. I mean, no, absolutely not. This is the same guy who literally just a couple of months ago broke up the potential for a rail strike when it was desperately needed and the workers were simply making basic demands. But he buckled down to these fear-mongering narratives about, oh, this is going to cause so much, economic damage, and essentially gave the win to the corporate side of that equation. So he's definitely not perfect. He's definitely not like the most pro-union president we could possibly imagine. I mean, obviously not. But at the same time, as I'm willing to obviously give good faith critiques of the Biden administration and their more corporate tendencies, I'm also going to give them a little bit of credit when they put in place a National Labor Relations Board that's actually making decent decisions like the one that we just talked about. But so he calls himself the most pro-union president in American history. And on Monday, a week before Labor Day, and as many workers around the country are either on strike or poised to go on strike, the Treasury Department released a report about the benefits of unions and what the administration can do to help boost unionization. They say unions benefit the middle class in that they raise members' wages by 10 to 15%. I mean, this is something we've talked about with right-to-work states. If you're in a state that allows for right-to-work to exist, typically, obviously, conservative states, you do see a drop-off in the wages because you are undercutting the power of the unions, and unions not only positively impact the wages of the people who are members of that union, but also just across the entire American economy. And they continue on that. They say this is according to the report, which also said that unions help to improve wages and benefits for non-union workers, affecting the well-being of many families and communities. Because again, you're essentially just lifting the floor of what is expected, right? For example, the UPS workers just got, what some people are saying doesn't go far enough, but still a better contract than they had before. And, you have all of these ghouls like Jim Cramer going on CNBC and crying about how the corporate side of that equation got screwed in this negotiation and there was a standoff for a potential strike. But the point is they get these new added benefits, better wages, better working conditions as a part of the UPS contract, and then that will pressure other delivery companies like FedEx or whatever the case may be to then lift the floor because now they're competing with these offerings that are being made because of the successes of the union at UPS. So it brings everybody up at the same time. And again, I mean, that's just the main takeaway for me, is that obviously, I mean, you are going to have more strength if you're trying to get better wages, better working conditions, better benefits, etc. You're going to have more strength in trying to achieve that if you are coordinating and organizing and potentially threatening strikes with your fellow workers as one giant collective than you otherwise would be able to do as an individual, right? So, I mean, the power of the unions, we've seen this during this recent resurgence. We've seen some of the more recent contracts that they have been able to get success on. We've seen this massive wave at places like Starbucks and Amazon, etc. So, I mean, you love to see it. Again, that report wasn't telling us anything that we didn't already know. And, although the Joe Biden administration does do things like breaking up, potential strikes and sabotaging them, to be honest, I mean, like, this is one of those things that you got to give Biden credit on it, right? I mean, he put in place a National Labor Relations Board that has been at least relatively much more pro-labor, which, on the one hand isn't really saying that much because we've had, president after president after president that has been explicitly anti-labor. And, if you watch the GOP debate, especially just last week, I mean, literally the only times throughout the entire debate that the word union got brought up, it was when they were attacking unions. So, I mean, don't get it twisted. This is just one of those examples where Joe Biden, where, Democrats, if you want to say that, are just slightly better than Republicans on this issue. And so again, credit to them for putting this rule in place. We'll have to see how this works out with the Trader Joe's union and how this actually ends up functioning in practice. But this is a massive labor W, and I don't think that anybody can undercut that.